All right, folks, gather around, because today we're diving deep into a graphics card that, for a long time, has been the go-to for many PC builders looking for that sweet spot between price and performance. The NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3060 12GB. Launched a few years back, this card made waves with its generous VRAM and promise of solid 1080p and even some 1440p gaming. It quickly became a benchmark for mid-range builds, a reliable workhorse that could handle demanding titles without completely emptying your wallet. But time, as they say, waits for no tech, and the GPU landscape in 2025 is a very different beast than it was at its launch. New architectures have emerged, game requirements have ballooned, and what was once considered mid-range might now be struggling to keep up, or perhaps it's found a new lease on life as a budget king. So the big question on everyone's mind is, does the RTX 3060 12GB still hold its own? Can it power through the latest AAA titles? How does it fare with demanding features like ray tracing? And crucially, with current pricing and the alternatives available, does it still make sense to pick one up? We're going to put it through its paces, looking at everything from raw performance in today's hottest games to its ray tracing capabilities, current market price, and what else you could get for your hard-earned cash. We'll be looking at benchmarks, discussing real-world gaming experiences, and comparing it against its contemporary rivals, as well as newer options that might be vying for your attention. This isn't just about numbers. It's about value, longevity, and whether this card can still deliver a gaming experience that satisfies in the current year. It's a tough question, but one we're determined to answer. So, buckle up, grab a drink, maybe a screwdriver if you're feeling inspired to build. Let's break down if the RTX 3060 12GB is still a good buy in 2025. So, let's get right into the meat and potatoes. How does the RTX 3060 12GB actually perform in the latest and greatest games of 2025? We've thrown a whole suite of titles at it, from sprawling open-world adventures to fast-paced competitive shooters. At 1080p, which is still the most common resolution for PC gamers, the RTX 3060 12GB continues to be a pretty competent performer. In many modern AAA titles, you can expect to hit that coveted 60 FPS mark, often with medium to high settings. Games like Cyberpunk 2077 with its demanding cityscape, or the latest Far Cry iteration will require some tweaking. You might not be maxing everything out, but a smooth, playable experience is definitely achievable. The 12 gigabytes of VRAM really helps here, preventing stutters in games that love to gobble up memory, especially at higher texture settings. Now, what happens when we push things up to 1440p? This is where the RTX 3060 12GB starts to show its mid-range DNA a bit more. While it can run games at this resolution, you'll need to be more aggressive with your settings compromises. For many demanding titles, hitting a stable 60 FPS at 1440p will mean dropping to medium, or sometimes even a mix of low and medium settings. Less demanding titles or well-optimized sports games like Valorant or Apex Legends will still sing, often well above 100 FPS even at 1440p. But for the graphical showcases, the latest single-player epics, you're looking at a 30 to 50 FPS experience if you try to stick to higher visual fidelity. It's playable, for sure, especially if you have a G-Sync or FreeSync monitor, but it's not the buttery smooth experience you might get at 1080p or with a more powerful card. The key takeaway for raw gaming performance in 2025 is that the RTX 3060 12GB remains a solid 1080p card. It can deliver enjoyable frame rates with good visual quality in most new releases. For 1440p, it's more of a budget entry point. You can do it, but expect to make significant concessions in graphical settings to maintain smoothness. That 12 gigabytes of VRAM, though, continues to be its ace in the hole, giving it a bit more breathing room than some other cards in its original performance bracket, especially as games become more texture-heavy. We'll see this VRAM advantage pop up again when we discuss other features. It's holding on, but the strain of modern titles is becoming more apparent. All right, let's geek out for a minute and talk about APIs, specifically DirectX 11 and DirectX 12. For those of you who might not be super familiar, an API, or application programming interface, is essentially a set of tools and protocols that allows software, in this case games, to talk to your hardware, like your GPU. DirectX 11 is the older, more established API. It's been around for ages, it's well understood by developers, and it's generally quite stable. Think of it as a seasoned veteran, reliable, but perhaps not always taking advantage of the newest tricks. It tends to rely more on single-core CPU performance to manage draw calls, which can sometimes lead to bottlenecks in complex scenes, even if your GPU has power to spare. DirectX 12, on the other hand, is the newer kid on the block, designed to be more efficient and give developers lower-level access to hardware. This means it can spread CPU workload across multiple cores much more effectively, reducing bottlenecks and potentially allowing for more objects and effects on screen. It also enables newer graphics features that DX11 simply can't support. However, DX12 can also be more complex for developers to implement optimally, so a poorly implemented DX12 mode in a game might not always perform better than its DX11 counterpart, and sometimes can even introduce instability if not done right. It's like giving a chef more control over individual ingredients. They can make something amazing, or they can mess it up if they're not careful. So how does our trusty RTX 3060-12GB handle these two APIs in modern games? Generally, the Ampere architecture, which the 3060 is built on, has pretty good DirectX 12 support. In many newer titles that offer both DX11 and DX12 modes, you'll often see a slight performance uplift, maybe 5 to 10% when running in DX12, especially in CPU-bound scenarios. This is because DX12 can better leverage your multi-core CPU to feed the GPU. However, it's not a universal rule. We've seen some games where the DX11 mode is still smoother or more stable, possibly due to developer implementation or specific driver optimizations at the time. The 3060-12GB isn't powerful enough to see massive gains purely from the API switch like some higher-end cards might. But the benefits of DX12, like better CPU utilization and access to features like ray tracing, make it the preferred API for this card in most modern titles that support it well. Now for the feature that NVIDIA has been pushing hard since the RTX series first launched, ray tracing. For the uninitiated, ray tracing is a rendering technique that simulates the physical behavior of light, leading to incredibly realistic reflections, shadows, and global illumination. It can make games look absolutely stunning, but it's also incredibly computationally expensive. The RTX 3060-12GB, being an RTX card, does have dedicated RT cores designed to accelerate these calculations. But the question is, how well does this entry to mid-range card actually handle this demanding feature in 2025's games? Let's be frank, if you're looking to crank up all the ray tracing effects to ultra in the latest AAA titles at 1080p, let alone 1440p, and still maintain a smooth 60 FPS, the RTX 3060-12GB is going to struggle significantly. With ray tracing enabled even at 1080p, you'll often see frame rates dip into the 30s or even lower in graphically intense games if you don't employ some assistance. The visual payoff can be there. Reflections look amazing, shadows are softer and more natural, but the performance hit is substantial. For many, the trade-off might not be worth it if it means sacrificing that much fluidity. It's a feature it can do, but not without heavy compromises. This is where NVIDIA's DLSS, or Deep Learning Supersampling, becomes absolutely crucial. DLSS uses AI to upscale a lower resolution image to your target resolution, effectively clawing back a significant chunk of performance lost to ray tracing. With DLSS set to quality or balance mode, running ray tracing on the RTX 3060-12GB becomes a much more viable proposition, especially at 1080p. You might be able to get playable frame rates, often in the 45 to 60 FPS range, with medium ray tracing settings in many titles. Without DLSS, ray tracing on this card is largely a slideshow or a look how pretty this can be for a screenshot feature. So yes, it can do ray tracing, but DLSS is pretty much a mandatory dance partner if you want a decent experience. So, after looking at raw performance, API handling, and its ray tracing capabilities, we arrive at the big question. Is the RTX 3060-12GB still worth your money in 2025? This is where things get a bit nuanced. On one hand, it's a card that still delivers a very respectable 1080p gaming experience. You can play most modern titles with decent settings and achieve good frame rates. That 12 gigabytes of VRAM, which seemed a bit overkill at launch for its performance tier, has aged surprisingly well, giving it an edge over some 8 gigabyte cards in texture-heavy games or when you're pushing settings. It's a known quantity, drivers are mature, and it's been a reliable workhorse for many. However, the GPU landscape doesn't stand still. Newer architectures from both NVIDIA and AMD have entered the market, often offering better performance per dollar or more advanced feature sets. While the 3060 12GB can technically do ray tracing, it's not a strong ray tracing card without heavy reliance on DLSS, and even then, you're making compromises. If ray tracing is a high priority for you, you might find its capabilities somewhat underwhelming compared to newer options, even those that might fall into a similar price bracket now. The raw rasterization performance, while solid for 1080p, is also being challenged by newer GPUs that might offer more frames for your bucks. Ultimately, the worth of the RTX 3060 12GB in 2025 heavily depends on its price, which we'll get to in a moment, and what your specific needs are. If you're primarily a 1080p gamer, you find a great deal on one, especially on the used market, and you're not chasing ultra settings in every single title or high-fidelity ray tracing, then yes, it can still be a viable option. It's a card that can still provide years of enjoyable gaming. But if you're looking towards 1440p gaming as a primary goal, or you want a more robust ray tracing experience, or simply the best bang for your buck in terms of raw performance in new titles, then you really need to carefully consider the competition and current pricing. It's no longer the clear-cut mid-range champion it once was. Alright, let's talk numbers that hit the wallet. The price of the RTX 3060 12GB in 2025. Now, GPU pricing is a notoriously fickle beast, influenced by supply, demand, cryptocurrency shenanigans, though hopefully less so these days, and the release of new generations. When the RTX 3060 12GB first launched, its MSRP was around $329. However, we all remember the dark times of the great GPU shortage, where finding one at MSRP was like finding a unicorn, with street prices often double that or even more. Thankfully, things have calmed down considerably since then, but that launch MSRP is a distant memory for a new card. As of early 2025, if you're looking to buy a new RTX 3060 12GB, you're likely seeing prices hovering in the $250 to $300 range, depending on the specific model, the AIB partner, like ASUS, Gigabyte, MSI, and so on, and any ongoing sales or promotions. Some premium models with beefier coolers and factory overclocks might still command a slight premium, perhaps pushing a bit over $300. We've seen a gradual decline in its price as newer generations have established themselves, which is typical for older hardware. It's no longer the hot new thing, so retailers are often looking to move remaining stock. The used market is where things can get particularly interesting for a card like the RTX 3060 12GB. Given its age and the number of units sold, you can often find them for significantly less than new prices. We're seeing them go for anywhere between $180 to $240, sometimes even lower if you snag a good deal. This is where its value proposition can really shine, especially if you're on a tighter budget. However, buying used always comes with its own set of considerations: warranty, previous usage, like was it mined on, and so on. So, while a new one sits in that budget to mid-tier price bracket, the used market definitely makes it a more compelling budget option if you're willing to go that route. Price trends suggest it will continue to slowly decline, especially as even newer budget cards arrive. So, if you've got that $250 to $300 burning a hole in your pocket for a new GPU, or perhaps a bit less for a used one, what are the alternatives to the RTX 3060 12GB in 2025? This is where the decision gets really tricky, because the market has some compelling contenders. From AMD's camp, you'll likely be looking at something like the Radeon RX 6650 XT, or maybe even a lower-end RX 7000 series card if prices have fallen favorably, like an RX 7600. The RX 6650 XT, for instance, often trades blows with the 3060 in raw rasterization performance, sometimes edging it out in non-ray trace scenarios, and can often be found for a very competitive price. Its main downside historically has been weaker ray tracing performance and a feature set that, while good, might not match NVIDIA's DLSS in terms of widespread adoption, though FSR has come a long way. From NVIDIA's own stable, you might be looking at the RTX 4060, the direct successor. The RTX 4060 typically offers slightly better raw performance, significantly better power efficiency, and access to newer features like DLSS 3 frame generation. Though the base DLSS upscaling is available on the 3060 too. However, the RTX 4060 launched with only 8GB of VRAM, which has been a point of contention for many, especially when looking towards future proofing, even at 1080p. So it's a trade-off newer architecture, and features with less VRAM versus older architecture with more VRAM. Depending on the specific games you play and your tolerance for VRAM limitations, one might appeal more than the other. Then there's Intel's Arc series. Cards like the Arc A750 or A770, especially the 16GB A770, if you can find it near this price, have shown themselves to be surprisingly capable, particularly after numerous driver updates. They offer competitive rasterization, decent VRAM amounts, and their ray tracing performance can be surprisingly good for their price class. However, driver maturity and game-specific optimizations can still be a bit more hit or miss compared to the long-established players like NVIDIA and AMD. Each alternative has its pros and cons. AMD often offers strong rasterization for the price. Newer NVIDIA cards bring efficiency and features like frame gen, but sometimes skimp on VRAM. And Intel offers a new option with good potential, but perhaps a bit more pioneering spirit required from the user. It really makes you weigh what's most important for your specific build and use case. So, after all that, what's the final verdict on the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3060 12GB in 2025? Well, it's not quite the straightforward recommendation it once was, but it's definitely not out of the running either. For 1080p gaming, it still packs a respectable punch, capable of delivering enjoyable frame rates in most modern titles, especially if you're willing to tweak settings. That 12GB of VRAM continues to be a strong point, offering a bit of future-proofing and smoother performance in VRAM-hungry games compared to some 8GB alternatives. However, its 1440p performance is more of a compromise, and its ray tracing capabilities, while present, heavily rely on DLSS to be truly usable. The value proposition really hinges on price. If you can snag one for a good deal, particularly on the used market where it can dip below $200, it becomes a very attractive budget to mid-range option. But when looking at new prices, around that $250 to $300 mark, it faces stiff competition from AMD's offerings, which might provide better rasterization, and even from NVIDIA's own newer, more efficient cards like the RTX 4060, albeit with its own VRAM caveat. You really need to weigh what's important. Is it VRAM capacity, raw 1080p performance, power efficiency, or the latest features? The 3060 12GB offers a specific blend that might just be right for some. Ultimately, it's a card that has aged reasonably well, but the tech world moves fast. It's no longer a performance leader, but it can still be a loyal soldier in your gaming rig under the right circumstances and at the right price. What do you think? Do you have an RTX 3060 12GB? How's it holding up for you in 2025, or are you considering one? Let us know your experiences, thoughts, and any questions you might have down in the comments below. We love hearing from you guys. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more tech breakdowns.